On the night of 2nd December 1875, Malay forces under the Yam Tuan Antah captured the village of Paroi, today on the outskirts of modern-day Seremban. This was scarcely 5 miles from the British residency in Sungei Ujong. The Malays fortified the village, raised their stockades, and prepared themselves for a confrontation with the British that would determine nothing less than the future of the independent Minangkabau states of the Malay Peninsula. In this video, we will revisit the extraordinary clash that took place a few days later. This was a moment when the British found themselves outnumbered, surrounded, and hovering perilously close to disaster. It is the story of a desperate bayonet charge across a swampy killing field, and of cold British steel meeting Malay krises in the stockades. On December 3, 1875, the British position at Sungei Ujong was desperate. Their garrison at Rasa consisted of only 45 men of the 1st Battalion, 10th Regiment, under Lieutenant H.C. Hinksman, supplemented by 20 additional men from the regiment under Lieutenant Peyton, who had been hurriedly rushed from Malacca. With hundreds of Malay fighters streaming into Paroi just 5 miles away, the British were in imminent danger of being outflanked, isolated, and potentially overwhelmed. Recognizing the precariousness of the situation, Hinksman worked frantically to strengthen his defences. The men's quarters at the barracks were hastily fortified and transformed into a strong redoubt. 10 days' provisions were laid in, and all barrels filled with water in preparation for a possible siege. Every hour brought fresh urgency. The British did not know the full strength and dispositions of the forces gathered against them. On December 4th, 2 days after Paroi fell to the Malays, Hinksman led a reconnaissance in force towards the village. His column numbered over 70 personnel, including 31 men of the 10th Regiment, 30 local police, and 6 Arabs. Accompanying the force were Acting Assistant Resident Captain Patrick James Murray and the Penang Superintendent of Police Henry Plunkett, who at the moment was also serving as Acting Lieutenant Governor of Malacca. Their advance from Rasa began at 5:30 p.m. along a narrow, twisting jungle path. It was so thickly overgrown that the troops were forced to march in single file and were unable to deploy a forward firing line. It was a vulnerable approach from the very outset. As the British neared Paroi, they suddenly came under fire from a well-concealed Malay stockade located about 150 yards ahead. Because of the constricted path, the British column could not form an effective firing line against their well-entrenched assailants. Heavy fire was exchanged between the two sides for 10 minutes. Hinksman was then startled to see large parties of Malays rushing out from the stockade towards the head of his column, threatening to envelop his flanks. This was quite unexpected, as the Malays had typically chosen to remain behind their fortifications in previous encounters. Recognizing at once the danger of imminent encirclement, Hinksman made the only prudent choice he could. He ordered an immediate retreat back to Rasa. The emboldened Malays pressed forward in vigorous pursuit of the fleeing British. A force estimated at between 150 and 200 men advanced to within half a mile of the Datuk Lanna's house at Ampangan, close to the British residency. They established themselves in the surrounding houses, fortified their positions, and relentlessly harassed the British with intermittent sniping all night. Reports soon reached Rasa suggesting that the Malays intended to attack the British outposts directly, and it appeared that a major night assault might be imminent. Fortunately for the British, the anticipated night attack did not occur. The next day, December 5th, Murray led a party of 15 men of the 10th Regiment with a brass 9-pounder field gun to the Datuk Lanna's house. He shelled the Malay positions in the surrounding area, and persistent long-range fire from the Martini-Henry rifles of the 10th Regiment eventually forced the Malays to withdraw from the vicinity and fall back towards their main stockades at Paroi. The tide began to turn the following day, December 6th, when reinforcements arrived from Malacca in the form of the Arab Contingent, a mercenary force of 85 Arabs led by former French naval officer Captain A.M. Fontaine. These were a diverse and rather notorious collection of fighting men. Arabs, Egyptians, Somalis, and Indian criminals and ruffians recruited from the back alleys of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore. They had previously served Tengku Kudin as a police force in Selangor and had seen action in the fighting at Klang and Kuala Lumpur. Noted for their ruthlessness and their ability to go through every obstacle, they would add a formidable edge to any British attack. With these reinforcements, Murray felt sufficiently strengthened to launch an offensive. The combined force assembled for the assault on Paroi totaled approximately 176 fighting men. 45 rank and file of the 10th Regiment under Hinksman and Peyton, 85 Arabs under De Fontaine and Robinson, and 46 policemen under Sergeant Bird. The force also included the 9-pounder brass gun under Captain Murray, though hauling it from Ampangan to the battlefield would significantly delay its arrival. However, the forthcoming fight for Paroi would not be an easy one for the British. The Malays held a strong defensive position. Their numbers were estimated at between 400 and 800 men. A deeply entrenched and heavily fortified main stockade dominated the village, with additional breastworks and stockades resting upon jungle-covered hills guarding both flanks. Between these hills and facing the main stockade lay 170 yards of treacherous open ground, a narrow winding track cutting through an almost impassable swamp dissected by the Lingi River. For any force bold enough to cross this open ground, the place could quickly become a killing field. The British advance commenced at 5 in the morning on December 7th. The plan required the main body, Hinksman's 10th Regiment troops, the policemen, and half of the Arab contingent, to advance steadily along the open ground. Meanwhile, the other half of the Arab contingent would sweep through the jungle on both flanks. On the right, 20 Arabs under Fontaine's second-in-command, Mr. Robinson, were to threaten the enemy's left flank. On the left, another 20 Arabs were tasked with penetrating the jungle to cut off the defenders' right flank and sever their avenues of retreat. At 7:30 in the morning, Robinson made contact with the Malay stockade on the right flank. Malay gongs sounded the alarm, and volleys of gunfire soon crackled through the jungle. Hearing the engagement on their right, The 10th Regiment in the central column moved quickly behind a small ridge about 170 yards from the main stockade and unleashed relentless volleys of fire from their Martini-Henry rifles upon the Malay defences. The Martini-Henry rifle was introduced in 1871 and was a defining symbol of British imperial power, and the campaigns on the Malay Peninsula would be the very first time this iconic weapon was fired in anger at a major conflict. A technological leap from the earlier Snyder-Enfield rifle, it was a breech-loading rifle with a formidable range, rate of fire, accuracy, and stopping power. A correspondent of the Bombay Gazette later reported that the continuous roar of rifle fire from the Martini-Henry rather astonished the Malay defenders at Paroi. However, the fighting at Paroi also showed that the new weapon had a critical weakness. Hinksman noted that when the rifles became hot with repeated firing, its cartridge extractor would become jammed. He said that 8 or 10 of his men told him their rifles were jammed and useless, and they were forced to take rifles off the dead and wounded. In addition, the superior range and power of the quick-firing Martini-Henrys were of little advantage against a strongly fortified and dug-in enemy. The Malays were exceptionally well protected by their breastworks and palisades, and they returned fire with deadly determination. Exposed on the swampy open ground, British casualties steadily mounted. Quite unexpectedly, the stalemate was broken when the 9-pounder field gun finally arrived at about 10 a.m. after its grueling haul from Ampangan. Positioned only 100 yards from the Malay lines, Captain Murray personally directed its fire. Between 6 and 10 well-aimed rounds smashed into the main stockade, and gradually the once fierce Malay fire began to slacken. Recognizing the moment, Hinksman judged the time ideal to storm the stockades while the defenders were still reeling from the bombardment. Hinksman ordered his 10th Regiment troops to fix bayonets and mount a full charge across the swampy open ground. The Malays resumed intense fire as the British and Arab troops struggled through the mud and waterlogged terrain, and casualties were heavy. As the British pressed forward, Captain Murray's black retriever was seen gallantly racing ahead of the men into the gunfire. The dog bounded forward with fearless enthusiasm before being struck by a tin bullet and collapsing on the ground. The Malay stockade on the left flank was the first to fall. As the British clambered over the timber ramparts, they encountered the most determined resistance. Malay chiefs stood behind their men, kris in hand, vowing to cut down any who fled. This may explain the near fanatical defense that held until the defenders were cut down or bayoneted. The Arab contingent likewise captured the stockade on the right flank. Captain de Fontaine and Lieutenant Peyton were the first 2 men to dash into the fortification. However, intense fire from the main stockade soon forced them to withdraw. They mounted a second, even more desperate charge, and ultimately secured the angled salient on the right of the main stockade. As the British centre and both flanks converged on the main stockade, the Malays retreated up the hill behind their fortifications, carrying away their dead and wounded. The 10th Regiment maintained a steady fire upon them, inflicting further casualties, though the troops were too exhausted to mount a pursuit. Fighting ended at about 11 in the morning. The engagement had raged for more than 3.5 grueling hours. The cost was severe. The British suffered 41 casualties out of roughly 170 men. nearly a quarter of their combatants. This included 2 killed and 13 wounded from the 10th Regiment, 5 killed and 10 wounded among the Arabs, and 4 police constables and 2 of the Datuk Kelana's men killed. Captain Murray's fearless hound, who had earlier led the charge, was found to be still alive. It had been shot in the leg, and soldiers had pulled it from the battlefield and tended to its wounds. Nursed back to health behind the lines with the other injured, the dog became something of a mascot, winning the affection of soldiers who half-jokingly declared it deserved a Victoria Cross for its remarkable courage. Malay losses were estimated at between 60 and 80 killed and wounded. 12 bodies were found within the stockades, and another 30 were discovered further up on the road towards Bukit Putus. This was highly unusual, as the Malays almost always carried their killed and wounded off the battlefield. One Malay defender, impaled by a bayonet thrust and left for dead, later recovered enough strength to crawl, kris in hand, towards a private of the 10th Regiment who was sitting with his back turned. He was spotted by other soldiers and bayoneted again. Although the cost was high, Murray expressed satisfaction with the outcome. He wrote to the Strait Settlements Governor, "The lesson has been a severe one, and the cost is also heavy, but the moral effect will, I trust, repay us." For the British, heavily outnumbered and nearly surrounded, everything had hinged on a single desperate charge across lethal terrain. Victory was secured only by the brutal determination of cold steel at close quarters. Although casualties were steep, the initial rush of Malay resistance was stemmed, preventing a storm of revolt across all of Sungei Ujong and possibly beyond. For the Malays, Paroi was a valiant stand, a stark reminder to the British of how fiercely the people of the Minangkabau states were willing to defend their land and sovereignty. Paroi did not end the war. It merely pushed the defenders back 6 miles to Bukit Putus, where new stockades rose, new strategies were forged, and another bloody showdown awaited. And that, dear viewer, is where our story will go in our next video. Until then, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do consider giving it a like, sharing it with your family and friends, leaving your thoughts in the comments below, or subscribing to join me on future adventures exploring the lost chronicles of Malayan history. You can also help support the channel by going to the Malayan Chronicles Patreon site and joining as a guardian of the Chronicles. Until the next episode, I remain as ever your grateful chronicler. Cheerio.